All right, welcome to the Leadership Academy dRep Book Club. This is book club number 2 for the dRep series. Let me share my screen really quick to do an intro. So the Leadership Academy has been putting on a couple of book clubs in the past. This is the dRep version that was funded in Fund 8 and Fund 9. And there is a Discord server here that you can join. And we're covering 4 different books. The first one was more of a white paper, The Treasury System for Cryptocurrencies. Book number 2 is today, The Power of Experiments by Michael Luca and Max Bazerman. And then book 3 is Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. And book 4 is Reinventing Discovery by Michael Nielsen. So these are 4 books that were recommended by IOG, actually. When you signed up to be a dRep, the reply email contained 4 books recommended for dReps to read. So I thought it would be interesting to put together a book club so we could all go through these together. And you don't have to be a dRep. You could just be interested in the topics to be here. So yeah. And we record these. If you want to catch up with what we talked about last time, there's a link in the Miro board to the YouTube channel, and I'll be doing the same for today once we're done here. Let me copy the link to this, and I'll throw this into chat. So if you want to, there is a Miro board here today that we'll be using, and you're very welcome to add notes. We'll be going over stuff. There'll be 3 main themes to today's thing. We'll talk about the key themes in the books. We'll have a section where we can talk about actual experiments that you all might have done and how you've used experiments in the past. And then we'll talk about experiments in Catalyst, particularly as dReps. What can we do? And some of the ethical considerations around experiments, which might be interesting. So yeah, as we discuss this, feel free to drop your notes in here. There's some pre-set stickies you can use. And then at the very bottom, people love to share links and resources. And some of the books mentioned in this book, like Nudge from Thaler and Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, were mentioned as some of the fundamental thinking around some of this. So I just dropped those in. Maybe we can add those books to our list later on. But yeah, that's kind of the kickoff. To start things off today, we are talking about the power of experiments, decision-making in a data-driven world by Michael Luca and Max Bazerman. Just as a quick intro, how many people actually read the book? You don't have to have read the book to participate, but I'm always curious who's actually gone through it. And I know Logan said he just started it, and Kenrick has acquired it. So I know a few people are either starting to read or in the process of reading. So, all right. So you're all new to it, basically. So I'm glad I put together the key themes. We'll go over that in a little bit of detail right now. The book basically has 3 main kind of areas that it talks about that I pulled out from it. One is the value of experiments. The other one is the practicalities of experimentation and what goes on. And then there was a section towards the end about the ethics around experimentation. And a lot of the book goes through actual case studies, and it talks about experiments providing a powerful tool for making informed decision and testing assumptions. And experimentation can be used in a wide range of contexts, from business to public policy to healthcare. They had a whole wide range of case studies in the book. And it started with some areas from public policy and healthcare. And then it went into some of the heavier experimentation that was done largely through Silicon Valley companies like Netflix, Amazon, companies like that heavily rely on experimentation for their product development. Experiments can help us identify causal relationships, generate insights, and discover new ideas. And experimentation is particularly useful in situations where we have limited information or face uncertainty. And I linked the book down here called Nudge, because it started with talking about how experiments through nudging actually were really interesting based on public policy and healthcare and stuff. And I pulled a quote out. In the best of worlds, nudges draw on our knowledge of people's biases to anticipate their decision-making mistakes and design systems that have the potential to correct for these mistakes. Thaler and Sunstein advocate nudges as a tool that can allow well-intentioned policymakers and managers to help improve people's decisions. And what is a nudge? It's basically a subtle and indirect method of influencing someone's behavior or decision-making without using coercion or outright incentives. And the concept of nudging is based on the idea that people can be encouraged to make certain choices or behave in certain ways by making small changes to the context in which they make decisions. One of the examples they had in the book was around how many people actually do organ donation on their driver's license. And they kind of experimented and showed countries that have it as an opt-in system and countries that have it as an opt-out system. And they found that when you have to opt in and say, yes, I consent to having my organs donated when I die, it had lower uptake than where you had to actually opt out and say, I actually don't want to do this for whatever reasons. So it did show that there was a lot of ways you can nudge things, and the way you present information, the way you make choices, either positive or negative, can totally change the outcome of different things. So those are kind of the experiments that they were talking about through nudges. Here's another one. For example, a cafeteria might nudge people towards making healthier food choices by placing healthier options at eye level or making them more visually appealing. Another example could be an online shopping website that nudges customers towards making a purchase by displaying items that are frequently purchased together, or by providing social proof in the form of customer reviews. So you see this a lot on Amazon. It's not outright coercion, but they're kind of nudging you for a certain outcome. And finally, they're often used in public policy, healthcare, marketing, and other fields, and are based on insights from behavioral economics and psychology. So the two books that are linked below are really around behavioral economics, which is kind of an emerging area that really influences how experiments are done and are really contributing a lot to the field. And they're typically low cost, non-intrusive, and are intended to help people make the choices that are in their own best interest. So that's nudges. The book also gets into the practicalities of experimentation, and it really talks about how to design and conduct the experiments, and how it does require careful planning and attention to detail. Key considerations are sample size, randomization, statistical analysis. Effective experimentation requires clear goals, well-defined hypotheses, and rigorous data collection and analysis. And here's a quote I pulled out. Having a product or service evaluated through a rigorous experiment, organizations have a much clearer picture of the value it can bring stakeholders. And then the final and most interesting to me personally part of the book was the ethics of experimentation. So it went into the ethical considerations and how they're an important part of designing and conducting experiments. Issues such as informed consent, data privacy, and the potential harm to participants must be carefully considered and addressed. Effective communication is also essential for ensuring the results of experiments that are presented in a transparent and ethical manner. And some of the quotes I pulled out: companies should be held to high standards for transparency and ethics in experimentation. Is it okay to use experiments that may increase profit but leave your customers worse off? So calling out some of the questions around that. And the ethical stuff is really around, if you're nudging, you're actually changing the behavior of people by default a little bit. And if you're doing that for nefarious ends, that's of concern. And even if it's for experimentation for positive reasons, if you have like a test group of an A and B group, and you know that B is going to be better off, is it ethically correct to be giving that other group a less effective experience, especially if it deals with healthcare or outcomes that can drastically affect the quality of their life? So those are all like really interesting questions that I would love to get into. So those were the kind of how the book was laid out. And honestly, I found the book a little bit heavy on the case study side of things, and my eyes started to glaze over after the 20th one. But they were all fairly interesting. And so I guess starting there, what do people think about the whole concept of experiments, and how have you used experiments, I guess, yourself, either in the work you've done or other areas? Just looking at chat. Yeah, Alex said it's emerged at several Nobel Prizes, have been won. And yeah, clearly through some of the work done through Thaler and Hahnemann and stuff. Yeah, there's lots of Nobel Prizes in economics there. Alex, you want to kick us off?
You asked about the experiments, and the question that I had in mind when I was going here is a little bit a long way because it's hard to think. I apologize. So like now I'm working with on testing software, and it's essentially an experiment. I make an assumption. Okay, this code should produce this result. This is called a oracle problem in testing. And an oracle is output that I expect. And well, and the question that I'm having is, in software, it's already quite difficult to imagine what is going to happen, and it's deterministic. But we have economic experiments in Catalyst, and for example, in the CIP that is being like the hype and the paper that you suggested before on the CIP, they point out like voter satisfaction is the KPI for like by which we measure the success of this treasury. But voter satisfaction is like populism. I can give promises and like, well, it's like Donald Trump. And well, I'm really sorry that I don't have any solutions to offer, but like that like was the first thing that came to mind. That is all.
Really good point. Thank you. Logan.
Sorry, it took me a while to find the mute button. Yeah, when I've been listening to the book and just kind of hearing your summary, I've been thinking about, so for my project, we're building governance infrastructure. And a lot of our experimentation has been with working with project owners to understand how they want votes to be weighted. So do they want to have quadratic voting? Do they want to have multiple governance assets that count for different types of voting? What are the consequences of all this? And then what we're kind of experimenting with now is, you know, we have this problem, or more so, the concept of DAOs has brought about this idea that, okay, there is value to having like this transparent community engagement. So we're really running experiments to say, okay, where can we bring this in the real world? Maybe not adding, you know, maybe there isn't, you know, a blockchain governance asset. Maybe it's just like a point system where members of an organization can level up. Members of the organization can level up based off referrals or whatever the organization sees as valuable. And they can get more influence in the organization there. So we're talking to, you know, some nonprofits about how they engage their community. We're talking to some influencers and YouTubers asking about, you know, how do you incentivize your community? How do you kind of engage collective intelligence? That type of thing. So I really do resonate with this kind of experimental mindset because, you know, if we're on this call, we do all kind of appreciate this kind of nascent and new technology that we think is going to be a big part of the world in the future, but it's our job to kind of experiment and figure out, where does this fit in? How can we get this to be, you know, have real world adoption? So yeah, those are just kind of some thoughts I had.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Logan. Kenrick. You're muted, Kenrick.
Yes. Before I start, Logan, where can we find out more about your community? Maybe you could put it in the chat.
Yeah, I'll put the Discord in there. It's probably the best place to get plugged in.
Okay, super. Yeah, so as a engineer / scientist, experiments have been a big part of my own professional and personal life. One of the latest ones I'm working on is to understand the governance properties of sociocracy and dynamic governance. And once I kind of read about it, I thought, oh, you know, there's really important ideas here. I don't know how well they would work, but I felt it was important to try them. So I've implemented them in my own small business where right now I'm a sole proprietor, but I have been talking with the contractors that work with me about expanding to an employee owner business. And so as a first step, we put a leadership team together using the idea of a consent-based circle to make decisions as a team. And it did really help me kind of rethink my own leadership styles. I think often in the past as a leader, I tended to listen to people's input, but then expected that I had the responsibility to make a decision. Whereas in this consent-based circle, anyone has the authority to kind of propose ideas, and anyone has the authority to object to those ideas. And I think it really is interesting, but it's very much an experiment. And I'm interested. We haven't had any problems yet, but I'm kind of waiting to figure out what the flaws in this approach are.
I have a question for you, Kenrick. You said it's an experiment. Did you start with a hypothesis or something you're trying to solve for? And how are you going to measure whether it was successful or not as an experiment?
You know, that's a great point. I would say that we did not like specifically define a hypothesis. However, that would be a great thing to do. So maybe I should work with the team to think that through, and that would help us evaluate how it's going.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good next step. That's a good suggestion.
Awesome. Stephen?
Yeah, thanks, Nori. I'm reminded of, Project Catalyst's, first slide, things may break, and, this is an experiment and all. And always occurred to me over the past few years, what is the baseline? Okay. And I was wondering, Nori, if you encountered that in this book, and if you could speak to that about, I know in your summary, you referred to the importance of, capturing data and everything, does it refer to experimental baselines? So knowing, where you're starting, where you're going, what have you come up with?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think a lot of the book centers around experiments that are enabled because we live in an age now where we are able to collect a lot of data based on things that we just do. Like if you look at Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, every click, every mouse drag, every interaction, every like is tracked. And that data enables them to run some of these experiments where they can see this is the current pattern, this is the current rate of whatever. And then if we change this or move this box or change the color of this button, we assume that this is going to happen. And they want to test it before they roll it out. And that data is really important to prove out whether the experiment was successful or not. So a lot of the book talks about the new type of experimentation that is enabled because we're collecting so much data, which makes me wonder, how much data are we collecting here? Like, do we automatically know how many people show up to each breakout room after town hall? Or do we do all these kind of data collection, or are we just letting all that data slip through? And then if we want to run an experiment, we can't actually go back in time, like you said, and set up that baseline because we don't have that data and we have to start from scratch. So those are really interesting questions, I think.
It seems familiar also from, I mean, Harsha, what you were doing with challenge teams at the town hall. You know, a challenge team has to look at the baseline of a challenge, and see how far the proposals have met that is the intention, if you like, of the challenge. So we encounter it all over the place, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's like, what data should we be collecting just to enable easy stuff? And then how open is, since we're talking about Catalyst, to instrumentation? So, and then like just also getting the second part, we're going to talk about the ethical stuff, but yeah, what's the privacy kind of things we need to think about? What's the ethical standards? How do we not make it feel or even be that we're explicitly nudging people in a certain way without their consent, right? Those kind of things are all things I think we need to talk about. So we heard from Kenrick running a sociocracy experiment. Are there any other experiments that you all have run or are running? And really curious if you're using some kind of scientific method with a formal hypothesis and then looking at measuring it in a certain way. Looks like maybe not.
Depends what you mean by scientific measuring. Like many of the workshops I do heavy analysis. I pull the qualitative information and construct new workshops based on that, but it's not really numbers. I don't check how many times somebody writes sticky notes on a Mara board when I ask a question, or how many times they use chat when the question is like, I don't do numbers based or quantity. And of course, we are also in meetings where we track feedback and there are some quantitative information we collect on the feedback forms.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've been in some of your meetings where you collect feedback through feedback forms. Do you, Tevo, start with some kind of thought around that data collection? Is it used to just basically reflect on it and see if we can improve stuff moving forward in a retrospective sense? Or are you experimenting with some kind of I believe that doing something this way will have this outcome and this feedback form will help see if that was true or not?
If it's about qualitative information, what is collected, then I rarely kind of have a vision for that, but it's more used to direct thinking. But when quantitative information is used, or numbers or feelings or anything that can be counted, this is something I use basically to visualize and put it in a graphic, because from my not expertise, but from my business life and more places where I have to demonstrate outcomes, there I have the most powerful tools have usually been using data points, and it then gets even more across when the data points are created by the people themselves, and then you show a graph. Well, this is what you are doing, and this is how it affects. And as you can see, the graph goes down, this goes up. The qualitative information, the quantity of qualitative info goes up if you do this, and like visualizing, and that is just like a hypothesis that if you put numbers in the game, I can use it to build the story of, and that's basically the only reason. And that's just from, I guess, self-experience and also the interest of figuring out what works and like kind of.
Can I ask Tivo, how important do you think is the clarity on the starting point? Because we just referred to the baseline. Okay, so when you do your exercises, because how you describe them, they can often be like an exploration of something, yeah? But then that feels like, is there an ethical dimension there? Because you could get carried away by the process. So do you need to be clear about where you're starting from, so that you know that you've got to a point where, okay, we've talked about this starting point, now's the time to stop and to see what we have concluded?
Yeah, the retrospectives are, to me, are these steps, and looking at the data and sharing it already also is a step to me, which can stop or continue or change directions. However, having clear starting point, I guess this is my weakest point, because I usually just love it to jump straight into stuff. So that is something I probably need to learn or understand. How do you even start any discussion that is universal, if it's even is universal, or and yeah, like, I guess I will be not able to answer that because not enough expertise and on that, like how to start the like any facilitation in a way that everybody has clear understanding where are they starting from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the practicalities of experimentation does talk about like the careful planning and attention to detail, having clear goals, well-defined hypothesis, and rigorous data collection. So it's not just a casual thing, it's actually very intentional. And then talking also about effective communication is essential to be transparent and ethical. So I think a lot of that ties in. And maybe, I don't know, maybe to get into a better experimental mindset, maybe we need like workshops or different sessions to teach people about like experimental fundamentals. Like, here's how you do an experiment, here's what it looks like, and be a little more intentional about it. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? And then Harsha, I see your hand is up too. So feel free to.
So I just had a question about what you're talking. Without a hypothesis, wouldn't it just be trying stuff out rather than experimentation? So like if we are saying I'm experimenting on something, that necessarily means we do have a hypothesis and we are trying to test that hypothesis out. So in general, when we are speaking, at least I use the term experimentation very loosely. So I do think there is some level of confusion here and there.
Yeah, I think that's, I kind of would pick up on what you're saying, Harsha, and I think sometimes that's what Tivo does, is he does an well, forgive me, Tivo, you do a kind of exploration, okay, and that's not necessarily bad, you know, it's just it is what it is, you know. And forgive me, Kenrick, working with you, Kenrick, you're much stronger on, you know, okay, here's the scope, okay, like I'm thinking of the white paper we worked on. So it's like, this is what we're doing, you know, this is where we're trying to get to, and then when we get to that point, we need to go back to the beginning to see if we've fulfilled that objective. Then maybe there's a place harsher for both of those approaches.
Coming back to what Nori mentioned, like having different meetings and education, to me, this is the hard part, because the question you asked, Stephen, do you need to be clear where you are starting from? To me, it feels like I need to first educate them what kind of meeting it is, how it scopes down to all the previous meetings I had in my life previously, and where this is going to lead to. But this whole section could take like 50 to hours of, and not even actually able to go into the content, because the participants there will be on so many different places. And that's why I just like to kind of, this is what we are, and like having more quicker brief, leaving people confused in chaos, because it's kind of hard to kind of get all aligned anyway, and just jumping into an action. And once they do the action, some people get it, some don't, but once you kind of resolve the action or what was done, then people kind of get the feeling of what is happening here, and they sense all the rules and all the education which was not described. And when we do more experiments in the same call, then it gets more more comfortable in the call, continuing further. But yeah, I guess that's like this exploration part which you mentioned, and which
is it a similar question? I don't think it is, but is the difference between exploration and experimentation similar to the difference between the quantitative and the qualitative? I know you can have qualitative experimentation. I'd be interested to hear what people think of that.
I think I recently saw a video, and I'll drop a link if I can find it, around redesigning society around meaning or something like that. And in there, they talked about how to measure values, which are very qualitative. And they did it in an interesting way. It wasn't done really through like numbers and our happiness is a 7 or whatever, but they laid out some objective, like internal goals, like feeling safe or being able to contribute to a conversation and things. And then you can reflect and say, did we achieve these? And if we did, then we're actually kind of creating spaces that match these values. So there are ways of doing, I think, real experiments on those values without having to have a hard numerical data set around it, perhaps. I would love to try that. Kenrick, your hand is up.
Well, that's an interesting insight, Nori, and I think it's important in terms of this discussion about community governance now, because I feel like we're kind of doing things a little bit backwards. I just attended the workshop, which was terrific, and once the NDA we're under is lifted and they published the transcript, I'll plan to talk more about it. But one of the things that struck me about it is that they're also planning to do a workshop on writing the Constitution, but I feel like it's backwards. I feel like they're implementing a design before they've written a Constitution. And then in the comments on Vanessa made a comment today or recently in the community governance website that she's not sure about a constitution, and more importantly, she's not sure that a constitution should talk to ethical issues. But I actually think that even before you get to a constitution, having a discussion about the ethical framework of how we're going to govern ourselves as a community is the critical first step. It's not an easy thing to do, but without that step, there's no framework for how we are going to govern ourselves. And therefore, there's no purpose towards the designs that are going to get implemented. And I'll just make a comment, I'll have more to say about this later, but my essential thing is that there's a rush to get a technically feasible design out and working. But that design is not going to have democratic principles in it. And I think, and that I think is a concern. And so I think if we can frame an ethical discussion about what the foundations of our community are, that would be a very valuable thing.
Mhm. Really good points. Thanks, Kenrick. Ken.
Like I think with experiments, you usually have a goal. And so you're trying to maybe prove if something is correct. And a lot of the goals, like going back to what Kenrick was saying, like the ethics are tied together with the goals when you're talking about governance, because different people may have different goals as to what they see a functional society looking like. And so maybe there's things where everybody can agree that there should be overlap. And that's sort of a moral framework thinking about that way. But like with experiments, you're trying to iterate on things and see how close you can get to a goal, or you're trying to say that something is repeatable, say that okay, this shows that there's some underlying mechanism that is causing this to function in a certain way.
Yeah, those are really good points. Maybe it's a good time to move over, since we're starting to do so, is in the Catalyst kind of, or Cardano kind of context, how can we use experiments? What ethical considerations do we consider? What data do we need to collect? And how could it improve our sense making and decision making? Just to throw those out there as starter places. But one thing that I'm thinking about is a lot of people have a lot of opinions around we should do decision making like this, or governance should look like this. And I think there's opportunity here to say, oh, those make really great hypotheses. Why don't we experiment? So formulate that statement as a hypothesis, and then we can throw some funding at it and we can run an experiment and say, does it actually make sense to run governance in this way? And maybe we run multiple parallel experiments, and that's what kind of Catalyst is already. It's a space where we can run multiple parallel experiments. And maybe Catalyst itself is something where proposals start with a hypothesis, and then people say, this is how I'm going to prove that. And then you get funded and you try it. And if it's great, then you can continue along those paths. But if it doesn't work, then we've learned something. And that might be a really powerful mechanism, at least for some challenge categories. Stephen.
Sorry, I just got my mute button. It's funny you say that, because I was gonna, before the pause in the Fund 10, I was gonna working on a challenge design. Is Catalyst ethical? and now there may not be challenges in the future. We don't know, but there's still, I'd quite like to partner with you, Nori, or anyone else here on a proposal that I came across this paper called The Ethics of Blockchain in Organizations from 2022, and that really describes exactly what you're describing, Nori. What it did is it looks at business ethics and business operations, and then sees what's the difficult classical ethical approaches to blockchain in each instance, like virtue ethics, like utilitarian ethics, that kind of thing. So that could form, I'll put a link in chat, but that could form the basis for a proposal. There it is, yeah. A proposal that, as you say, it'd be a really interesting proposal, actually, where I'm not sure how you would need to know what you're applying the ethics to, of course, yeah. But then you would just say, okay, we're going to say, let's take this ethical approach to this subject, yeah. and then just see how that plays out. So utilitarianism, you could apply a certain approach. Virtue ethics is another approach, and there's other forms of ethics as well. So and it'd be interesting to see how that would inform how your starting points. Yeah. So the assumptions you're making at the beginning, like Kenrick's saying, like often these ethical approaches and attitudes are assumed and built into even a technical specification. So for example, in SIP 1694, in the technical specification is a parameter for a constitution. Okay, so it is not out of scope, it's actually a technical parameter in there. So it's kind of, you could argue that's built in, and constitutionalism, yes, it does involve ethical considerations. You may agree with them, but that's another matter, So I really love your idea, Nori, and I think I'd be quite happy, anyone here, to work on that idea.
Mm-hmm. That may be a really good Fun 10 collaboration. Yeah, let's keep talking about those ideas. How else can we use experiments in Catalyst, do you think? Or I know a lot of people represent a lot of different groups here. Do you have any ideas on what you might take back to the groups and say, hey, we should try experiments in this or that? Or do you see it being useful at all as a methodology?
Well, what I see is that these experiments, what have been done so far, are being reused. And they are applied beyond Catalyst. And I think that is the beauty of this place here, which kind of brought together a lot of like-minded people, very passionate. At the beginning, later there was more push on entrepreneurialism, and then a different mindset of people joined in. But I think in all of these iterations, the lessons learned of how to facilitate, how to build the product, how to create a best good user interface for Cardano community, or any of these things which are built on Catalyst. So right now we have about 50% of the finished proposals, where I would say 10% of them are being reused, which is in business world, this is a very good outcome. In our space, I would say that it could be better, but I think we are working towards having like these reusable outcomes. And yeah, like what I see, because we are doing like more emphasis on open source, so the experiments probably will trigger out to more communities outside here. That's the kind of the key element.
That's another aspect of experimentation. I'm not sure. I think you might even refer to it, Nori, where is reuse. So, and again, that comes out of like our hearts as well on the challenge team or whatever. Is like what has been learned, and how can that be copied is one way to put it, but it's also to reuse. And so that's a very interesting way of expressing it, Thibaut, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, how as a catalyst, as an innovation fund, and this is as an experiment, how this is used is to represent what is possible if you just build enough rules into the game of distributing money that you're able to actually get very huge impact compared to some other mechanism. Like there are a bunch of innovation funds out there, and some have no participation at all, even though there is money on the line, but it's just so hard to get that, and then people get discouraged. And this is more loose, with the loosest I have ever seen in terms of rules, and that is also something for entire world to learn about. Oh, you can actually build something, like you can have quite a good outcome by just not throwing out money, but like doing these kind of decentralized ways of distributing rewards. So the participants kind of do the decision making. And that is already being used by SingularityNet when they built up the defunding. They looked at it, they perceived some information, they adopted to that, and then also did kind of, because they were more open about it, and probably that kind of directed me and a lot of other people to find them, which then also integrated with all the learnings we had from Catalyst. So now there are more of these experiments, innovation experiments, which are different and are also using the lessons learned from both of these innovations. So it's reuse again.
Yeah, there's a kind of tension. I think a lot of us here are familiar with that tension between, there's people are given money and they're not asked lots of questions, and they can just do what they want, and you get a lot of mud thrown, and then you get people say, you should pay the right people, and it should be very quantified, and you should get a hard result back, a very cold result back. But the problem is, Thibaut, I suppose, is proving is saying, look, we've been relaxed in the way in our innovation fund, if you like, and that's allowed innovation. You can innovate through a certain relaxation of the rules, but that it also creates instability because it becomes hard to demonstrate that.
Yeah, and I think most people don't even realize that this Catalyst has been more of an educational journey for many people, which have taken them from just finishing the school or doing something very specific and able to learn leadership, management, all of these things once they get funded. And funny thing is that if you look at most of the proposals, never had a business or like a full team, and now they're got into position where they're charged of money and accountable of using that, and that gives a very strong push to growing a person to be useful to add value to the community. Of course, there are people who take advantage of that, and the more times we run this system, the more people will find out this system and kind of use it against them. But then we have these discussions, okay, how do we kind of get these people who want to abuse us into a different path and a bit less of rewards, but still keep it open for those totally new people who are just exploring the world and finding out that money is made up.
I guess it comes back to the baseline, and perhaps maybe the David Kalman book I think there's a reference in the Spiro board to that, isn't there, Nori, where thinking fast, and where sometimes problems, very small problems, get exaggerated far too much, and also the other way around. Like you have big problems that are not exaggerated enough. So for example, you may have a couple of people who are taking advantage of their fund and just not doing any work and just taking all the money. But if you look at that statistically, or you'll see that's probably, and I think everyone here will probably agree, that's quite a minority, of a very, very small minority. But the problem is it becomes a political point. It becomes blown out of all proportion often, so it's often about how to contextualize that. So to say, and that's part of arguably the baseline for Project Catalyst, So it's to say Project Catalyst isn't perfect. You know, it's going to have flaws, and that's another thing actually, is admitting failure. You know, so yeah, that's what. Sorry, I'm making a few points there.
Yeah, I think, yeah, admitting failure is a good thing, especially if we learn from it, then we're continuing to be a evolutionary learning organization. And just based on the conversation, I think it's interesting that Project Catalyst itself has a number of built-in nudges. Like a lot of people for the first time are coming and face-to-face with self-management and having an environment when there's no manager or bosses to tell you what to do every day. You kind of show up and you're self-directed, and that's a whole new kind of baseline environment in which to operate. And we're running a huge decentralized experiment on how do we work together as a community when nobody's really in charge. And it's all based on making proposals and voting and getting funded, and then you're kind of self-directed to execute on what you've promised. And I think it's a really fascinating nudge experiment, and there's a lot of data here that we should probably be looking at, because I think it'll be really valuable for other communities and groups in the future that are looking at similar things. I'm just looking at the chat. Jeremy B has been posting a few things around reuse and adoption, our pull forward effects in Catalyst, which breaks them a bit. That would be interesting to hear more about. And I will definitely take the chat history here and put them into the board as well after we're done. All right. We are exactly at the top of the hour now. So Harsha, do you want to take us home with some final comments or thoughts?
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention where we can experiment in Catalyst without too much friction, that is. Specifically in these semi-centralized roles like challenge teams, audibility teams, and stuff like that, I think we have the freedom to experiment, and it's easier to experiment because there isn't a huge process of putting in a proposal, getting votes, and all of that. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
That's a really good point. And I think if we actually run those things as experiments to say, here's our starting point, we hypothesize if we do things this way, this will result, and then actually measuring that and turning it into an experiment would be really fascinating, because I think being more intentional with the definition of an experiment versus, we've mentioned exploration before, which we do a lot of, might be a step change in how we actually gain confidence and know that things are actually resulting the way we thought they would. Yeah, so this has been a conversation on the power of experiments. And for me personally, it's really kind of made me think about it, experiments in a different way, as kind of really, they have practicalities of implementation where you have to be thoughtful, do some careful planning and design, and really look at how you're going to be measuring and proving your hypothesis. But even just starting with a hypothesis and running an experiment and seeing how it turns out is a different way of thinking for me. So I've really appreciated the nudge from IOG to read this book as a dRep and dive into the topic a little more. So I appreciate everybody showing up. The next book, just to whet your imaginations and appetite, is Reinventing Organizations. Again, I know we ran this in the previous iteration of the book club, but it's a great book, and some of you may not have been able to attend the last one, so we'll run that again. So in about 4 or 5 weeks, we'll have another book club here at the town hall talking about Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. And then we'll finish up a month after that with the book Reinventing Discovery by Michael Nielsen. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming today. I appreciate your contributions and your thoughtful discourse. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
learning to be an inventor.
What's that?
I know, like,